Welcome to Movies That Matter, a podcast about recent films going above and beyond the call of box office returns to boldly explore a social issue affecting people's lives. I'm Nicole Fenari, and with me today is...
Adam Perry.
Adam, what movie are we going to overanalyze this week?
Stephen King's Dr. Sleep.
So, based on the novel by King, and also a sequel of interestingly, the film adaptation in a lot of ways of The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, Dr. Sleep is written, directed, and edited by Michael Flanagan, starring Ewan McGregor as Danny Torrance, who was a child in the first movie. So it follows the now adult Danny Torrance as he must protect a young girl with similar powers from a cult known as the True Knot, who prey on children with powers to remain immortal. Or long-lived, in any case. What did you think?
Well, I was pretty captivated by the movie the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was good. It was definitely interesting in terms of the follow-up to the Shining movie versus the book. Mm-hmm. And it also, to do that, differed a lot from the Dr. Sleep book as well. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of just sort of interesting things about it. And kind of like noise around the movie, even before, for me at least, when it came out, that to just watch it and be sucked into the movie the whole time and not really think about any of that stuff was pretty cool. I thought there were more than a few problems with it, but like it was definitely interesting and like worth watching.
I got nothing to add to that. Actually, I went in obviously like kind of with low expectations. We all know I'm not much of a horror fan. And I would say there was only sort of one or two true like horror scenes in the whole movie. But while I saw certain problems, which we'll elucidate after this, like overall, I was like, I pretty much enjoyed it. Yeah. Like I was absolutely captivated. I was never bored. I was interested in what was going to happen. I was, sort of engaged enough with the characters where I didn't want them to die and, felt sad if they did die. So, I was much better than I thought it was going to be.
That's not at all what I expected to hear. That's funny.
Picking apart some of the good and the bad for people. Where do you want to start? Bad news or good news?
So, I think, as much as I like the movie, I've been talking about it with people who either saw it or hadn't for the past, I guess it's been out for a week and a half. I've mostly focused on like bad stuff.
Okay.
Like the stuff I thought it did not do well. So I guess we could start there if you want.
Go for it.
So basically the problem I found with the movie was that we watched The Shining right before going to see this because it was billed as a direct sequel to the movie, not the book.
Right.
And, skipping over the...
Yeah, we're going to get into some book versus movie aspects.
Skipping over all that.
Let's just stick with the movie right.
So it's a sequel to The Shining, basically. Right. That's all we need to know for right now's conversation. It did not seem like they made this movie like The Shining, where The Shining has almost no narrative to it. If you watch it, it's very surreal, and there's almost like no typical scenes in the movie. And if you've read the book, The Shining, you know like what happens in the movie. But if you watch it, you also know what's going on too. And they tried to do that, I think, with the Dr. Sleep movie, where it was just very weird and almost like on purpose, like off-putting for a mass audience, I thought. And there were some scenes that I felt like really disrupted that effect that they had going on. Like mainly the one where like basically any scene in it with exposition like just felt so out of place because they did such a great job avoiding it for the most part that when it showed up, you were like, why is this in the movie? Like I was like, didn't understand. Like they did such a good job for the most part of that.
Yeah, I was going to say top of the line biggest complaint was some of the extraordinarily clunky dialogue.
Yeah.
And so I want to get into the performances in a minute, but like they really tried to sell the dialogue, but it sounded so silly and unscary anytime any of the like True Knot whatever band of villains said, like, I just love the steam. I have to get it out of the children. The steam. It just immediately was like, I'm not at all scared of these people anymore. Yeah. This sounds really dumb.
The whole, that was another thing. They would have been better off. That's very true to the novel, that, the terminology they use, the vernacular. And they probably would have been better off jettisoning some of that.
Mm-hmm.
And they did a lot of good stuff, streamlining that group for the movie, which we can get into later. But they weren't scary. And I thought that it worked for the movie because the movie is just weird. And it didn't need to be
right?
The whole movie is just menacing. So I was actually kind of glad that they didn't have an over the top sort of villain presence as well, because it was more like, this is just a weird world.
Yeah, it was atmospheric. It was just it's one of those things I've said before about once you see the alien, it's not, or the monster, it's very hard to be like, oh, it's a silly man in a costume. It's very hard to maintain the level of fear once you know what it is. And whenever they would talk about what they were actually doing, it just sounded so silly. You couldn't maintain the level of menace. So I would agree with you on that. And I agree with you on the sense of that is what Stanley Kubrick did so well. Show, don't tell. This is a movie, and a book you have to tell.
Yeah.
In a movie, you could see the steam. The visual was there. I didn't need the dialogue.
Yeah, and that's, I think, for the most part, the movie was successful at kind of emulating that sort of style, which is why whenever you, kind of get jerked out of that through, an expository scene, it's, felt so out of place.
Yeah.
And, I didn't mind, it was long, but I didn't think anything needed to necessarily be cut out of the movie. It just, we could have done without, I don't know if I said this already, but when Danny and Abra, the girl with the abilities, meet for the first time, it's just so off-putting, because it's you have the shining, calm down, I thought those two had a really great rapport for the most part in the movie, and I thought, Ewan McGregor I always loved, but I thought the girl was really great too, and it's just kind of I feel like they kind of shot both of them in the foot with that scene. It just didn't need to be, you could have had that done better, pretty much any way than
Again, anytime
did.
They explained what was actually happening, it sounded terrible.
Yeah.
And really dumb. But I agree with you, and I think part of a little bit what saved it were the performances. Love Cliff Curtis. That guy does not get enough parts.
Cliff Curtis rules.
He was just a great, sort of character actor. And again, really engaging. You were kind of sad when he died.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert. Belated. And I thought the little girl was great.
Yeah, she was awesome.
I thought, Rose the Hat, the big villain.
She was awesome.
Was awesome.
Particularly with a role so they changed a really major thing about the cult in the movie. So, for the better, I think. But she really did a great job with this kind of in the book, it's meant to be a really iconic villain. And in the movie, I don't think they played it that way at all. I think she was kind of just another character in the movie and doesn't seem to come across as villainous in the movie than as she does in the... I don't know if I'm explaining that very well.
Well, but I think... Well, it's interesting. I want to hear more about that, because I think in the movie, just from only having seen that, not read the book, one of the things that is so great about the way she plays the part is that she doesn't think she's a villain.
No.
And so her motives aren't I just love pain. She's just well, this is food for me, so I'm gonna do this. She's so matter of fact about it. And the villain who doesn't realize that they're a villain kind of is a lot scarier and a lot more interesting of a character than they're just two-dimensional. I'm evil to be evil's sake.
Yeah. It was that in a lot of horror movies that I've watched. Me and my buddy were watching one of the Saw movies, and there's just this over-the-top villain in one of them, and there's a quiet moment, and my friend just leans over and says, I do bad. It's yeah, we get it. But yeah, she was awesome. I don't think she's talking about someone who doesn't get enough part. I love her.
Yeah, no, I looked her up, and I was I'm sure I've seen her before, and I have in a couple things. she's also one of those actors, like, when I saw what she'd been in, I was like, oh, that was her, like, good at, like, sort of transforming her looks based on the part.
Yeah.
So...
Another great performer was the Crow Daddy actor, was really good, too. I like him a lot. He's been in other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, everybody put in a good performance, especially the cat.
Yeah.
Obviously, my nominee for my fake Best Animal Performance of the Year Oscar that no one has given out yet.
So that cat wasn't in the movie that much, if I recall correctly.
No, and so sort of as little as I know about Stephen King's, oeuvre overall, it seemed like a very Stephen King element to have that cat.
So the cat can tell when Danny is working at the hospice, the cat can tell when people are going to die. And that's like a very large part of the book is him working and living there with this cat that he befriends.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I really liked about it, which was a tough line to pull off, but I think they did successfully, which was, it is a movie about death, and it is a movie about ghosts, and it is a movie about sort of special human qualities. Like, they sort of navigated this realm, I thought.
Yeah.
Pretty well, where Danny's like, I don't know about God or hell or heaven or any of the things. Like, the character sort of asks, like, but he's like, I know we go on.
Yeah.
And I was like, that was handled delicately, and I think gave room for everybody.
Yeah, it was cool too, because the notion that just having a little bit more knowledge about life after death doesn't mean that you know the answers to the big questions. It's just like another stage, basically. Mm-hmm. Like, you can see ghosts and talk to people that are dead doesn't mean that you've solved the mysteries of the universe. It's just like another stage or step in understanding. It was very good at not, like I've talked about when there were scenes of exposition or, like, clunky dialogue. They also were fabulous when they were doing the opposite. It was, like, the peak kind of expression of, wordless sort of.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because I actually, like, one of the best and worst scenes at the same time, like, happened sort of together, which was when, so Rose, they sort of show her, she's sort of trying to psychically find Abra, the girl, right? And so they show her almost, like, astral project out of her body and go floating over the earth to, like, find this little girl. So when she's sort of flying around, I mean, it looked like Peter Pan over the cloud. That part looked really cheesy.
Yeah.
But the part where she, like, the camera flips and she, like, comes in the window and then, like, lands on her feet was, like, one of the best scenes I've seen in a movie this entire year. So it was, like, at first it looked really silly, and they, like, brought it back together in a really cool and interesting way.
It was almost like to disarm you.
Yeah.
You're like, this is stupid. And then it's just like,
yeah, it was well done. So I would say, like, and, we talked about sort of the compare and contrast of the original Shining. So I would say one of the things that didn't work for me, it's going to shock all the long-termers, was there was some really obvious and poorly placed CGI.
Oh, yeah.
In this movie that really did not work for me.
And it was interesting, too, because what they chose not to do CGI, at least as far as I could tell when I was watching the movie, was when they return to the hotel, they didn't seem to do CGI with the actor. So they did not
Star Wars this thing.
Yeah, they had new different people. Wendy. The guy who played Halloran was great and looked almost identical to the great Scatman Crothers from The Shining. And the kid Danny in the beginning sucked, but they used irregular kids. But they didn't choose to do that, but they CGI'd a lot of, like, the ghosts, it seemed like.
They just CGI'd, like, the whole, like, coming up the mountain pass to the Overlook, which looked terrible. And yeah, I mean, I for one was really glad that they didn't, like, CGI Jack Nicholson or whatever him and do all kinds of stuff to have him in the movie. Like, I was fine with them replacing the actors. I will say, sort of as iconic looking as Jack Nicholson is, replacing Shelley Duvall was just going to be a losing bet.
Yeah.
Like, she's like, she's even more like getting her sort of essence into another person. Like, just the mom just didn't.
No, she didn't cut it. But I mean,
but that's fine.
Yeah.
Like, I wasn't bothered by that, and that didn't like ruin any of the enjoyment. And I did really love the scene where Ewan McGregor, like, as an adult, like, confronts his dad and like sort of gets to say his piece, because I think that there was probably a lot more in the book, but like they deal a lot with the sort of trauma, having all these like sort of scary ghosts following him around for a lot of his childhood, but they don't as much in the movie touch on the fact that like dad tried to kill him.
Yeah.
That's gotta be a pretty formative experience to like what that does to know that your father's a murderer. Or not know, because maybe it was
You're
possessed.
Like 5 too at the time.
Yeah.
And that was, like, I was talking with my wife, who I saw it with, where they have another actor play Jack Nicholson, and like that kind of works because he was 5 at the time, and now he's like a 45-year-old man, and it's like the memory is going to be different from the reality, and that almost like kind of made it cool that they just used another actor that had the sort of Jack Torrance like look, as all these years have gone by, and he's, like you said, finally confronting this aspect of his past. And like, no matter how young you are, if you're like semi-conscious, you're gonna remember an experience like he had in The Shining. So
those were my two big things. Overlap with yours, the exposition when they did it, and then egregious uses. So those are like my two sort of big criticisms of the movie. Were there other things on your list you wanted to talk about?
No, anytime I feel like you have like a movie that's ambitious like this one, I almost appreciate it more because there are certain aspects that it fails at. Mm-hmm. And I guess there was one more thing that I kind of came out like being like, what were they doing with this? Where, so later in the movie, this cult is pursuing the young girl Abra for her special abilities to live off of for a long time. And in the film, her father is killed when they try to apprehend her. And I guess like about like the last quarter of the movie starts at that point. And nobody seems to care. Like, she doesn't care. Like, at the end, the mom is, like, kind of sad about it. But it seemed like nobody was like, hey, like, this guy just died. And that was very off-putting to me.
Oh.
I just felt like some kind of more of a deal should have been made about that.
Okay. Now, I guess I felt like, she didn't have time to process it. But I can see your point on that. I was trying to figure out if the fact that he was a writer was going to play into it somehow. And then go red herring or whatever. It
was more like that's what he did in the book. So I feel like they just, like...
Right.
And there's
did it have anything to do with anything in the book, or?
Like, not only to the fact that the parents' lives are way more fleshed out in the book.
Okay.
There's like a couple of twists in the book that are not in the film regarding that family. Like, basically that book, Dan Torrance is like the co-lead with Abra. Whereas in the movie, it was way more like the Dan Torrance kind of like the... However much you thought he wasn't the main character of the movie, even less in the book. It's like split basically 3 ways. The Rose, Dan, and Abra are like the main characters in the book. But yeah, I just thought it was like kind of like you're pretty sure that he got killed because the guy Crow who goes there is not gonna like leave him alive. But it just didn't seem, I don't know, it was poorly handled. I think.
So I thought it was interesting because I was sort of thinking back on, the original movie and this movie, and one of the like big issues I've had with this year. High Life was one. And there was another one which so one of the like chief complaints that I've had is that all these sort of like auteur directors like step into a genre like horror or science fiction, whatever, and it was like, I'm gonna make this like a real movie, real art. Yeah, and then you're like,
well, you sucked at it.
You sucked at it because you didn't think it was worth your time to know what came before, and actually what you created isn't this amazing thing because it's like the genre's moved 20 years beyond that at this point. Right?
Yeah.
Like, your stuff is actually really tired and derivative. Like, not, like...
You're not going to revolutionize this in, like, one fell swoop.
Yeah, because it's like you didn't bother to learn the film history about this. And so I was thinking, like, that was not at all the case of The Shining, nor of his 2001 either. It was like he stepped into a genre and he, like, it didn't matter. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
defined it.
Yeah,
that movie.
Absolutely. And I was just sort of thinking about, like, and so then in contrast to Mike Flanagan, who has made horror movies before,
he's a big horror guy,
like, was coming out and actually doing something, like, a little less traditional.
Yeah.
Horror than before. So
that's why he seemed like such a perfect fit. That this movie was like defying the audience almost. Like, and it was another one where, like, the advertising campaign was just not representative of what you were going to see at all, in my opinion. And it was like all that was in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's good that, you know, I had a certain expectation going into the movie of what it was going to be like, and I was just, like, flabbergasted, basically, like, by what I saw. And, you know, whenever something like that happens, it's, like, automatically good to me if it has problems.
Right.
You know,
yeah. It's
you did do something.
You tried something, yeah.
And didn't run your mouth about how you're like, oh, I'm stepping into this world that, you know, it's not, you know, high art or whatever. It's, like, the opposite, right?
Yeah, I really, like I said, have, like, watched more horror in the past few years than I have my whole life. Because people keep requesting horror films and there's so many good ones being made, they're hard to avoid.
The stuff has been good for a while. It's just, I guess now we consume so much that every genre is respected. You know?
Oh, I don't think the respect is there yet.
Really?
No, I don't. Well,
but not by, like, the old guard, but... You know.
I mean, I'll be really curious to see what happens with the Oscars this year. But I think it's maybe coming into its own. But then again, so on the flip side, like, I do think, like, one of the things that made The Shining that was so good was not just, you know, sort of obviously the elements of the film, of the acting, the editing, but just the practical effects.
Yeah.
Like, you're never going to forget that wall of blood.
The best illustration, I think, in the difference between the two is in The Shining, the tracking shot of Danny biking around the hotel is just, it's so loud, and you could tell they just, like, followed this kid on a camera. And then they recreate that in the new movie, and it just doesn't work. It's just not the same, you know. And I think they did a really good job of not being, like, super winking towards The Shining, because it was just a sequel to it. So when you do something like that, you're not, like, hiding Easter eggs for fans. But, like, that part, I feel like they could have probably cut that out, you know. Like, they didn't need to do any of them at the hotel again, you know, and it's like 82 or whenever that movie came out. It's 40 years old. Anyway. It just seemed very unnecessary. Okay. Like, whereas, like, the young kid in the beginning of the movie, that was necessary because a big part of the book where he learns to box up these sort of ghosts. I just don't know why they threw. Yeah, and another thing that seemed a little off-putting.
Yeah, and to your point about the ghost, like, you know, it's hard on one viewing to sort of pick apart the difference between two, but I mean, one of Stanley Kubrick's was in Menace, right? Like, you know, Hal is one of, like, creepiest characters on screen, like, ever created. And to your point about the CGI, like, the twin girls weren't as creepy somehow. Yeah. Like, he didn't have that, like, stark menace. But sometimes and this may not be a fair criticism, I'm curious your thoughts on, like, what the difference was. Like, for me, a lot of it was, like, it just felt like I don't know, like, it felt like a movie, it looked like characters in costume. Like, I never kind of lost the feeling that lost myself into the world in watching the show.
Well, so it's obviously, you know, it can't really top that. And I think what they did so well with this movie was just instead of trying to have that kind of stuff be scary again,
Mm-hmm.
they just made the whole environment weird and scary. And I think that like was what kind of like captivated me about the movie is like it didn't seem like it was the planet Earth. It just seemed like its own little world versus The Shining, where it's like ordinary people. The beginning of that movie is the only part where there's any kind of like, you know, typical scene structure where like he interviews for the job and the family's at home. Once they're on their way to that hotel, it's like all hell is broken loose and everything's crazy for no reason. Whereas with this movie, since they couldn't recreate that sort of feeling, they just decided to make the whole thing seem like something generally off about the world in general. And I think that was more important than the ghosts that they threw. Again, it's not like when the twin girls appear, it's not a winking reference for fans. It's him coming back as an adult and experiencing this again. And, you know, that's maybe the adult's perspective, that it's like not as scary. You know, almost it's going to be just like, oh yeah, I remember that from when I was a kid. It was really scary then, but now it's kind of like almost like silly. And then like the scene where he's confronted by all of them like really worked for me for that reason, because it's like, oh, I didn't just imagine all this and get scared at like when I was a kid, and it's really happening now, and that's like kind of ridiculous too. I don't know.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it that way, that the juxtaposition of, you know, the house that seems so huge and then you go back and you see it as an adult and you're like, oh, I remember this being a mansion. Like, why is it so small? Like, the things losing their ability to scare you in quite the same visceral way as an adult as they do as a kid, I think it's a really good point. Like, I hadn't thought of it that way. I think for me, it was just, to your point about the tracking shot and the otherworldliness of it, it did seem otherworldly, but then it felt like a movie set.
There were parts that I feel like I think they did a good job for the most part on that.
Whereas, like, the Overlook in the original movie feels like it feels like a real place.
Well, yeah, it was a real place.
I mean, it was,
too,
yeah, so. And it has that, like, I don't feel like I'm a movie set, like, so it just has that, like, really interesting impact of, and maybe too, like, to be completely fair to Dr. Sleep, like, I'm also not, you know, we've talked about this before, when I watch a movie for the podcast, I'm hyper aware of everything. I can't just, like, relax and lose myself into it, so I do the
opposite.
Well, it's like I have to remember all the things, you know? So yeah, I think an interesting perspective. How much of that was sort of in the book, the sort of adult Danny, like, with new eyes?
It's, I mean, like I said to you earlier, that the Overlook at the end of The Shining, the book.
Oh yeah, the Overlook is destroyed.
It's destroyed, and so where that sort of like what it is in Doctor Sleep is just the grounds are where the True Knot is based, and it's an RV park.
Okay.
And so in the movie they don't touch on this as much, but the True Knot travel by RV across the country finding these people. But they also feed on sort of like mass misery. There's a big part in the book, probably the first 50 pages or so, where they sense that 9/11 is going to happen. And so they go to New York and just stand, like they're parked across like the river while all the destruction is happening. They kind of feed on that. So that's like another thing that they do in the book that they don't at all do in the movie, which I thought was to the movie's credit. Like that would have been a little hard to kind of like have also be like a part of the movie.
Yeah, well, I think because then we sort of lose the central point about the movie. A lot of which is a throwaway line. Like, and this part also didn't work for me. Like, there's a sort of element of like they're dying off. There aren't as many people with supernatural powers anymore, or they're being suppressed somehow, and they don't have enough to feed off of.
I think they kind of translated that pretty well to the screen, because in the book what it is it's like chicken pox that kills them all. They're like all like the cult is a lot larger in the book, and so they start dying off from diseases that, since they're all super old, they haven't built up an immunity to, and it kind of like is already starting to rot them from the inside, which is why in the book Rose is so obsessed with finding this new food source that can last them for a long time, because she also can't face the fact that isn't going to solve the problem that they have. But also, so to your point about the adult Dan Torrance, in the book, it's way more focused on his alcoholism. And so he's sort of reckoning with that legacy. And I think they do a good job in the movie of making that more a part of the storyline than with The Shining, where that, like, in the book, The Shining, that's like a major, like, plot point. And that's why Stephen King was so unhappy with that adaptation. Because it kind of, like, it alludes to Jack Torrance having a drinking problem, but it's very explicit in the book.
Right, and in Dr. Sleep, like, again, one of the things I thought that was so brilliant about that scene is that when he confronts, you know, his father, is that they do sort of equate the alcoholism and the quote unquote demon drink, right? Like that it opens up a dark place in Jack Torrance for him to be taken over by sort of the dark spirit of Overlook, right? Like they sort of equate the alcoholism to the violence that comes. They give it somewhat of a supernatural explanation, but they also just give you the fact that, like, you know, opening that door into alcohol for a lot of people is a step towards violence and domestic violence specifically, right?
Which is a large part of the book. And they, in the Shining movie, I'd read the book probably about 3 times since I had last watched the movie. So I didn't remember in the movie. They do reference some of Jack Torrance's physical violence. I think, like, Stephen King's major complaint remains true, that Jack Nicholson just seemed crazy from the beginning of that movie.
Yeah.
Whereas
there's no transition.
Yeah. He just, like, it's all, like, 11 from the beginning. Yeah. But in the book, he's, like, you know, it's, like, written in, he wrote that book in, like, the 70s. It's pretty old. So it holds up. There's obviously some, you know, but he's, like, a loving dad and, like, a decent guy who is just, you know, bedeviled by alcoholism, and it causes his downfall, and it causes him to do a lot of bad things even before they get to the Overlook. So when they get there and it unleashes these demons, that's, like, way more explicit in the Shining book and not in the movie. And this was kind of, like, I feel like a corrective in Dr. Sleep while still being a Shining movie sequel.
Right, and they give you sort of both sides of it too, which I think is interesting. They show you or both sides, 2 sides, I should say, like alcoholism and effects of alcohol on people take many different paths, and they sort of show you, you know, they nod back to how it can use of rack who kids. Yeah. But they also show you Danny, who's sort of using it to as a, you know, self-medication.
Yeah, to, like, smother these memories, and his ability is stunted by it too.
Right, and it's not making him an abusive person, but it is making him into an abused person, right? Yeah. Like, it just makes him sort of make a lot a poor life choices.
Yeah. He abuses himself rather than other, like, the people around him.
And then, you know, in the meetings and in the getting clean and the, you know, sort of former alcoholics, you have Cliff Curtis, who is sort of implied that sort of checkered past. Yeah. And then you have this sort of very successful doctor who's also in AA.
Yeah. He was a way bigger character in the... And I was kind of weird, like, why do you have Bruce Greenwood play this guy? He's only going to be like... Yeah. Was awesome. Yeah. But...
So the movie definitely contends with alcoholism and has a larger make about it than the original Shining, that's for sure. Yeah.
And they did, like, I think it was cool how they did it too, because they still didn't beat you over the head with it either. It's just more apparent in this movie than in the Shining.
Yeah, and they give you the generational conflict as well of the kid like his dad and having seen the ill effects of it,
well,
or is late to pull himself out of that same path. So I thought, and I, you know, to his credit, which he often doesn't get very much of, although he has gained a lot of respect in this world too. Like, Stephen King's horror is usually a metaphor for something. It's not just cheap thrills, I guess, or cheap scariness.
Oh yeah, like, there's always some sort of subtext to it.
Like, and he's all the better and scarier for it, right? Yeah. So you know, it's always good to see him kind of gaining respect and people saying, like, I'm aware he has some real horrible he has some not very well written things out there. Not every single thing he's written is a winner, but the things that he has written that are winners, because they've always been in the horror genre, have largely been ignored, while leading to some of, again, the most sort of successful movies of our time. I did a Twitter poll, what's the most unexpectedly scary scene in a movie you've ever seen, and I was like, Carrie. Yeah,
his first book, by the way.
I mean, it's absolutely terrifying, and then you're like, wait, she got her period.
Yeah.
That's all that happened in that scene. It's not actually scary. But when you're in the scene, you're like, oh my God, what's happening? It's terrifying.
I will say this, for someone who writes as much as he does, and has as much coming out as he does, way higher percentage of it is worth reading than should be. It is unbelievable how, I've never read something of his where it's even if it's not as strong, there was always a reason to read it, and it's just he's so great.
Yeah, he is, and it's really encouraging to, again, the horror genre to get taken serious. It's nice to see a nod back to The Shining and someone make an effort to pay homage and make their own thing
at the same time.
Yeah, I mean,
because too much of the remakes and sequels feel like they have to have the moments from the original, as I guess a movie I've seen recently that's the biggest offender of this was Terminator. I saw the new movie where they just have to cram in all this stuff that references a movie that already came out, and it's forced, whereas this was just truly its own thing, and it referenced the original because it had to do with the original. But it's the big debate, would you watch this movie by itself? And I would say yes. It stands on its own. But
you shouldn't. You should also watch The Shining.
Yeah.
No, I think actually you said it. You said it best. You said it completely right when you said they're just Easter eggs.
Yeah.
All they're doing is and it's there's a lot
winking,
of yeah, it's just pushing a nostalgia button for the fans.
Oh, you've seen it too? Yeah, I get it.
Rather than what comes across in this movie is a deep, sincere love of the source material, right? He clearly loved the movie The Shining, clearly loved the book. The Shining and Dr. Sleep,
and he created something too. There's something new here,
right?
The director, when there was not quite a puff piece, but before the movie came out, he was interviewed and said that he went to meet with Stephen King about making the movie because he's a notorious Shining hater,
right?
And he's look, we're doing Warner Brothers is doing the Dr. Sleep movie. I'm going to direct it. I'm a huge fan. But it's a sequel to the movie. Are you cool with that? And he was yeah. I just thought it was kind of a cool story.
I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So sort of tying it all together on the social impact score.
Well, just in this world of, like we said, constant remakes and retreads, I think it's points alone for managing to thread that needle so effectively. I like the issues of alcoholism and the way the movie presented it, but it also didn't demonize the casual drinker either. So I 5, 6.
Yeah, I'm gonna give it a 6. I think we didn't talk about this so much, and it doesn't need to be brought up, but because it wasn't an issue. There's a great Lindsay Ellis video that I'll recommend called Woke Disney about how Disney is trying to go back and remake its movies and then make them all girl power in a really annoying way that does not work. Well, this movie had both a strong female villain and a strong female protagonist at the center who was also a teenage girl of color.
Cliff Curtis too. All those characters were white in the book. By the way.
Yeah.
Not that it matters, but...
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
And they did that. They wasn't hey, check it out. People of color.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean.
No,
I didn't bring it up because it just seemed like they chose the best actors.
It would be superfluous.
For the part, and the best kind of diversity is we just hired the best people for the part, and these people.
Yeah, it's this thing that we did.
And it's just really... I mean, honestly, it's really nice to have to kind of dig your feet into a really good female villain. That doesn't happen enough. And I think it did, like I said, without actually beating you over the head about the alcoholism. I think it did have some small, like, important things to say on that front.
Just, like, how, like, owning how it affects you and, like, what.
Right. I went in with really low expectations, and I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought it was. I was like, this is a decent enough movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've had 2 good ones in a row.
One of the better,
recommendations for the week?
Well, on the subject of alcohol, it's always important to remember that Nicolas Cage won an Oscar for one of the greatest movies ever called Leaving Las Vegas. If you haven't seen it, watch it.
And with that, thank you for listening to our podcast. If you want to talk to us about it, at Movies Matter Pod on Twitter, our website, moviesthatmatterpodcast.com. As always, links will be in the show notes. Keep listening. Recommend us to your friends. And go to our website. We have a link to our Redbubble store. Give a really fun movie gift to somebody in your life. And remember, movies matter.
And so do you.